He was once just Thomas Knight, an ordinary man in Miami. But in 1974, he would transform into one of Florida's most infamous killers, a man whose crimes were so brutal and whose time on death row lasted so long that his name became a legend in the prison system. It began with a wealthy couple, Sidney and Lillian Gans. On a quiet summer morning, Knight kidnapped them at gunpoint. He forced Sidney to drive to the bank and withdraw $50,000 in cash. The plan was perfect, until it wasn't. Hours later, Sidney was shot dead, and Lillian was strangled in the woods. By nightfall, Knight was caught trapped by the FBI with the stolen money still in his possession. Convicted of the double murder, Knight was sentenced to die. But his story didn't end there. Locked away on death row, he became even more dangerous. In 1980, inside Florida State Prison, he ambushed a corrections officer, Richard Burke, stabbing him to death with a homemade knife. 1 killer, 3 victims, 2 death sentences. For decades, Knight, now calling himself Askari Abdullah Muhammad, fought his punishment. Appeal after appeal, claim after claim, he challenged the system. Judges debated his sanity, his rights, and the endless delays of justice. Families of the victims waited nearly 40 years. Finally, on January 7, 2014, at the age of 67, Knight was led to the execution chamber. His last words were calm, almost defiant. He said he was at peace. Moments later, the lethal injection silenced a man who had outlived nearly every other prisoner on Florida's death row. But the haunting question remains: did justice arrive, or did it come far too late? Classification: murderer. Characteristics: kidnapping, robberies. Number of victims. Date of murders: 74, 1980. Date of arrest: December 24. Info: date of birth: February 4, 1951. Victims profile: Sidney and Lillian Gans, William Culpepper, store clerk, Richard Burke. Gate prison guard. Method of murder: shooting, stabbing with knife. Location: Florida, Georgia, USA. Status: sentenced to death in Florida on April 21, 1975. Sentenced to death in Florida on January 20, 1983. Resentenced to death on March 12, 1996. Executed by lethal injection in Florida on January 7, 2014. Florida executes Askari Abdullah Muhammad Thomas Knight for killing guards couple. January 8, 2014. Starka. A Florida inmate was executed Tuesday for fatally stabbing a prison guard with a sharpened spoon while on death row for abducting and killing a Miami couple. Askari Abdullah Muhammad, previously known as Thomas Knight, was pronounced dead at 6:45 p.m. Tuesday after a lethal injection at Florida State Prison, the governor's office said. The execution took place in the same prison where Muhammad killed corrections officer Richard Burke in 1980. "This is where my dad had took his last breath," said the slain guard's daughter, 7-year-old Carolyn Burke Thompson. She was among several family members who witnessed the execution and could be seen crying in the front row as it was carried out. "The system finally has worked. I am at peace knowing I don't have to wait any longer. I miss my dad a lot," she said. Muhammad, 62, was initially condemned to die for the 1974 abduction and killings of Sidney and Lillian Gans of Miami. Tuesday's execution was specifically for Burke's killing. Muhammad was visited by his 4 sisters, Monday and earlier Tuesday by a friend. He declined to make any statement before the sentence was carried out. A small group opposed to the death penalty protested outside the prison. His execution was delayed for so long by numerous appeals and rulings, including a 1987 federal appeals court, tossing out his original death sentence because he hadn't been allowed to put character and background witnesses on the stand during the penalty phase. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his final appeals, but Justice Stephen Breyer said in a dissent he would have granted a stay to hear Muhammad's claims that it may be unconstitutional to execute an inmate after such a long time on death row. Court documents show that Muhammad fatally stabbed Burke as he was being escorted to the prison shower. The inmate had become upset, the documents say, because he was told he couldn't see a visitor unless he shaved his full beard. The documents added he had been overheard by guards to remark that, "It looks like I'll have to start sticking people." In the earlier slayings, Muhammad had worked for Gans at a paper bag company before abducting him in the business parking lot with a rifle. He ordered Gans to drive home, pick up his wife, and then head to a bank to withdraw $50,000. Inside the bank, Gans asked a manager to alert authorities. Both the FBI and police were able to follow the car for a while, including use of aircraft, but lost track of it for a short time in a rural area of Miami-Dade County. Trial testimony showed that's when Muhammad shot the couple and tried to hide by burying himself, the rifle, and the money in mud and weeds. Muhammad was found soon after and arrested. While awaiting trial, he and 10 other inmates escaped from jail, leading to a nationwide manhunt, including a top 10 fugitives listing by the FBI. Authorities say Muhammad was involved after his escape in the fatal October 1974 shooting of a liquor store clerk during an armed robbery in Cordell, Ga. That wounded a second clerk. He was never tried in that case. The FBI finally arrested Muhammad on New Year's Eve in 1974, Florida. Muhammad converted to Islam, in prison changing his name from Knight. During his 1996 resentencing, he cursed at the judge and lawyers and yelled, "Allahu Akbar, God is great," in Arabic. Thomas Knight, who killed Miami couple, and a prison guard, executed January 7, 2014. Stark. Over a staggering 4 decades in Florida's criminal justice system, Thomas Knight repeatedly staved off execution for the brutal 1974 murders of a Bay Harbor Islands couple, breaking out of jail, murdering a prison guard, and disrupting court hearings with angry outbursts. But when all the appeals had finally run out, Tuesday evening, Knight exited the world without an apology to the families of his victims, or any statement at all. "No is all," Knight muttered, when a corrections official asked if he had any last words. He absolutely went out like a lamb. "Nothing like how he was in the courtroom," said retired Miami-Dade homicide detective Greg Smith, who attended the execution with Miami-Dade prosecutor Gail Levine. In the end, today was some measure of justice for the families. At 6:31 p.m., Tuesday at the Florida State Prison, his home for most of the past 40 years, Knight was injected with a lethal cocktail of drugs. The execution warrant was technically issued for the fatal stabbing of corrections officer Richard Burke in 1980. But he also had been sentenced to death for the brutal slayings of Sidney and Lillian Gans, who he had kidnapped and shot to death in the woods of South Miami-Dade 6 years earlier. Knight's blinking eyes snapped shut. Covered in a sheet, his hands wrapped in gauze, his arms pierced by IVs. Knight seemed to drift into slumber. His breathing slowed. A prison official tapped his eyelids and slightly shook his shoulders. At 6:45 p.m., a doctor pronounced the triple murderer, who had spent more time on death row than all but 2 other killers, dead. Behind a glass pane, Burke's daughters, who were raised near this same prison, watched in tears. So did 2 former co-workers of the slain officer. It's hard to say. "This is where my dad took his last breath," Carolyn Burke Thompson, 7 of Tennessee, told reporters afterward. "But I'm at peace now," said Burke's other daughter, Margaret De La Vega. "My daddy can finally rest in peace." The execution caps Knight's 40-year slog through the criminal justice system, which led one federal court to blast the gridlock and inefficiency of death penalty litigation. Even on Tuesday, the possibility of another delay hung over the final minutes. The execution was pushed back about a half an hour as the U.S. Supreme Court mulled but denied a final attempt at a stay. "It doesn't bring my grandparents back, but it's over. At least in some sense it allows us to move forward," said Judge Shapiro, the grandson of the Ganses. Shapiro and his mother declined to attend an execution they believed would be too draining emotionally. "I'd like to hope in some fashion this helps other people, that they realize that sooner or later, the right thing does happen," he said. "But it shouldn't take this long. It shouldn't take 40 years. At Rifle Point, Knight kidnapped Sidney Gans, a prominent businessman, and his wife in July 1974, forcing them to withdraw $50,000 from a downtown Miami bank. Gans was able to alert police, who covertly tailed their car as Knight forced them to drive south. But in a remote wooded area, Knight shot each of his hostages with a bullet to the neck before he was captured. He was found hiding in the woods, caked in mud, with the murder weapon and money. While awaiting trial, Knight escaped from the Dade County Jail. Police say he killed a shopkeeper in Georgia before his recapture, 101 days later. Knight was convicted of the Ganses' murders in 1970. Sent to death row. It was there that Knight fatally stabbed Burke in the chest. He was later convicted and sent back to death row for the crime. Years of appeals followed, and his death sentence in the Gans case was reversed in 1986. 1 decade later, Knight was again sentenced to death for the Miami-Dade case. A federal judge again reversed his death sentence in the Gans case, only to have it reinstated by a federal appeals court in September. A December execution was again delayed by a month after Knight alleged that a new drug used in the lethal injection process amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. The state's high court did not agree. On Tuesday, the beard Knight grew for the 1996 resentencing was gone. So were his outbursts. His final meal, unlike his life, was mostly sweet portions of sweet potato pie, coconut cake, banana nut, bread, vanilla ice cream, strawberry and butter pecan ice cream, and Fritos corn chips, all washed down by a quarter of a bottle of Sprite. Knight's dark history. July 17, 1974. Thomas Knight kidnaps and murders Sidney and Lillian Gans of Bay Harbor Islands. He is immediately arrested. September 1974. Knight and 10 other inmates escape from Dade County Jail. He is placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. October 1974. Police believe Knight and another man fatally shoot a liquor store clerk during a robbery for $641 in Crisp County, GA. He is not charged. December 1974. FBI agents capture Knight in New Smyrna Beach. He is found with a shotgun and 2 pistols, all stolen. April 1976. A Miami-Dade jury convicts Knight of murdering the couple. He is sentenced to death. October 1980. Using a sharpened spoon. Knight stabs and kills corrections. Officer Richard Burke at the Florida State Prison in Starka. March 1981. Knight is scheduled to be executed after Governor Lawton Chiles signs his death warrant. A federal judge stays his execution pending more appeals. January 1983. Knight is convicted and sentenced to death for the Burke murder. January 1996. A federal appeals court overturns his death sentence in the Gans case, ordering a new penalty phase trial. February 2. After a new sentencing phase, Knight is again sentenced to death. He is repeatedly banned from the courtroom because of his disruptive behavior. March 2006. With state courts repeatedly affirming his conviction and sentence, Knight's lawyers appeal to a Miami federal judge. November 20th. 6 years after the appeal was first filed, Miami U.S. Judge Adalberto Jordan reverses Knight's death sentence. He orders a new sentencing hearing or life sentences for the convict. September 2013. A federal appeals court reverses Judge Jordan, reinstating the death penalty for Knight. To learn about the gridlock and inefficiency of death penalty litigation, look no further than this appeal, the court writes. October 2013. Governor Rick Scott signs death warrant for Knight not for the Miami-Dade murders, but for the slaying of Burke. The execution is scheduled for December 3, November 2013. The Florida Supreme Court delays the execution, ordering a Bradford judge to hold a hearing to consider whether a new drug used in the lethal injection procedure constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. December 2013. The state's High Court lifts the stay of execution after ruling Knight has failed to prove the drug is unsafe. Governor Rick Scott reschedules the execution for Jan. 7 October 22, 2013. Miami killer Thomas Knight, one of Florida's longest-serving prisoners on death row, will be executed December 3 at 6 p.m. The governor's office said Monday. Gov. Rick Scott signed the death warrant for Knight for the 1980 fatal stabbing of state corrections officer Richard Burke. When he killed Burke, Knight was awaiting execution for the main 74 murders of Bay Harbor Island's Sidney and Lillian Gans. Only 2 inmates have been on death row longer than Knight, 62. His death warrant was signed 1 month after a federal appeals court in Atlanta restored his death sentence in the Gans murders. Although the warrant was signed for the Burke murders, Gans' relatives will likely be allowed to attend the execution at the Florida State Prison in Starka. Knight will be executed via lethal injection. Gans, a successful paper bag company owner, had hired Knight a parolee in 1970. 10 days later, Knight kidnapped him and Lillian at rifle point, forcing Gans to go to a downtown Miami bank to withdraw $50,000. Afterward, FBI agents covertly tracked Knight and the 2 hostages to a secluded wooded area at Southwest 132nd Street and 117th Avenue, where Knight shot each of them with a bullet to the neck. Officers later found Knight, who had buried himself in mud along with the money and his rifle. While awaiting trial, Knight escaped from the Dade County Jail and was involved in a fatal robbery before his capture. A jury convicted Knight of the Gans murders in 1975. A judge sent him to death row. While there in October 1980, Knight thrust a sharpened spoon into the chest of corrections officer Burke, 48. The reason the prison would not let Knight see his mother, who was making her first visit. Then Gov. Bob Graham signed his death warrant for the Gans murders. The execution was set for March 3, 1981. The prison system superintendent later remembered Knight's reaction to the news. "How can you execute me when I haven't even had my trial yet about killing the guard?" A federal judge later stayed the execution. Jurors in 1983 convicted Knight of Burke's murder. His convictions have been bogged down in the legal system. In 1987, a federal appeals court threw out the Gans death sentence, ruling that Knight should have been allowed to present character and background witnesses during a penalty hearing. He was again sentenced to death in 96. But then, late last year, U.S. District Judge Adalberto Jordan ruled Knight's constitutional right to confront and cross-examine witnesses had been violated at the 1996 sentencing. But the U.S. 11th District Court of Appeals last month disagreed and restored the death sentence. To learn about the gridlock and inefficiency of death penalty litigation, look no further than this appeal, the opinion said. Judge throws out death sentence in 1974. Miami-Dade murders. Only 2 inmates have been on death row longer than Thomas Knight, who kidnapped, robbed, and murdered a Bay Harbor Islands couple, and later a jail guard, who wouldn't let Knight see his mother. February 2, 2013. As agents closed in on him in the woods of southwest Miami-Dade, kidnapper Thomas Knight shot his 2 hostages execution style, then buried himself in the mud atop $50,000 in stolen cash. The savage 1974 murders of Bay Harbor Islands businessman Sidney Gans and his wife Lillian landed Knight on death row. But the legal case is still churning after nearly 4 decades. The latest chapter, a Miami federal judge late last year tossed out Knight's death sentence for the Gans murders. Prosecutors are now appealing the ruling. Knight, 61, nevertheless remains on death row for a 3rd murder, the fatal 1980 stabbing of corrections officer Richard Burke. "It's gotten to the point where it's a slap in face," said Judge Shapiro, the Ganses' grandson. Said the Ganses' daughter, Harriet Shapiro, no 72. "Even though I have no hatred in my heart, and I don't live with anger, I would be very happy to see him dead and stand there when they kill him." Only 2 prisoners have been on Florida's death row longer than Knight. His murder of the Ganses, while unfamiliar to newer generations of South Floridians, was a major story in July 1974. Sidney Gans, 64, owned a successful paper bag company and a minor league baseball team, the Miami Beach Flamingos. He taught his grandson to play baseball and served as a leader at his synagogue. Gans also employed parolees looking for a second chance. Knight was one of them. He had worked for the paper company for 10 days when he kidnapped Sidney Gans at rifle point. Knight forced him to drive to the Gans home, where he kidnapped Lillian Gans. The 3 drove to downtown Miami, where Knight forced Sidney Gans to enter a bank and withdraw $50,000. Knight, armed with a semi-automatic .30 caliber carbine, held Lillian Gans in the back of the businessman's car. Inside, Gans alerted the bank manager, who called authorities. Gans, fearing for his wife's safety, returned to the car. A slew of agents and cops covertly tailed the car as Knight ordered Gans to drive to West Miami-Dade. In a blunder that still riles the Gans relatives today, agents lost track of the car. In a secluded wooded area at Southwest 132nd Street and 117th Avenue Sod, Knight shot each of the Gans with a bullet to the neck. He disappeared as heavily armed officers swarmed the woods. For hours, authorities scoured the woods. Tear gas was deployed. A deputy found Knight buried in the mud, the money and the rifle underneath his body. Not long after his arrest, Knight and a group of inmates escaped the Dade County Jail. He remained a fugitive for 101 days, until agents burst in on him and holed up in a New Smyrna Beach shack. Judge Shapiro, when his grandparents were killed, remembers that while Knight was on the lam, a teacher was assigned to guard him while at school. Every child at some point comes to the realization that the world is not necessarily a safe place, and for me it came at a young age, and in an extreme fashion, said Judd Howe, an English teacher. A jury convicted Knight in 1975. A judge sent him to death row. While there, in October 1980, Knight thrust a sharpened spoon into the chest of corrections officer Burke, 48. The reason the prison would not let Knight see his mother, who was making her first visit. Then Gov. Bob Graham signed his death warrant. Scheduled execution date March 3, 1981. The prison system superintendent later remembered Knight's reaction to the news. "How can you execute me when I haven't even had my trial yet about killing the guard?" A federal judge later stayed the execution. Knight indeed went to trial for Burke's murder and was sentenced to die in January 1983. By 1987, a federal appeals court threw out the Gans death sentence, ruling Knight should have been allowed to present character and background witnesses during a penalty hearing. Knight's 1996 resentencing was held under heavy security. By then, he had grown a beard and changed his name to Askari Abdullah Muhammad. He proved too disruptive to keep in the courtroom, cursing daily at the judge and lawyers hollering, "Allahu Akbar, God is great" in Arabic. The jury, in a 9-3 vote, recommended the death penalty once again for the Gans murders. Circuit Judge Rodolfo Sorando Jr. agreed with the recommendation, but it was a legal error in that 96 resentencing that paved the way for Knight's latest successful appeal. U.S. District Judge Adalberto Jordan ruled in November. At the resentencing hearing, a Miami-Dade homicide detective recounted the words of a police helicopter pilot who never testified in previous court hearings. That, Jordan ruled, violated Knight's right to confront and cross-examine witnesses. Why was that testimony so important? The judge pointed out that defense lawyers claimed that Knight never planned to kill the husband and wife. Knight only shot the couple after he heard a police helicopter and suffered a schizophrenic break, defense attorneys claimed. But prosecutors insisted to jurors that Knight never knew cops were covertly tailing him. As proof, they pointed to the detective's testimony that the helicopter pilot did not arrive on the scene until well after the Ganses were dead. There is no question that the evidence about the helicopter was key, Jordan wrote in a 56-page order. Jordan also said prosecutors did not show all efforts were made to bring in the case's original detective as a witness. Greg Smith, the now retired Miami-Dade detective whose testimony was at the heart of Jordan's decision, bristles at the ruling. The Florida Supreme Court, he pointed out, had already upheld the 1996 death sentence. I find laughable the thought that Thomas Knight killed the Ganses because of the police presence. Smith said last week he wasn't traveling to South Dade to take them on a picnic. He was going to kill them because they could identify him as their kidnapper. Jordan ruled that prosecutors must hold a new penalty phase for Knight or agree to a life prison term. Knight's defense attorneys did not return calls for comment. Prosecutors are asking a federal appeals court in Atlanta to overturn the judge's decision. Jordan has since been named to that court, although he would not join any panel deciding on the case. On 05/27, Knight filed a direct appeal to the Florida Supreme Court. Among several issues raised, Knight claimed the trial court erred in the denial of his challenge for cause as to the impartiality of a juror. Second, Knight claimed the trial court erred in denying his motion for additional peremptory challenges because of pervasive pre-trial publicity. Third, Knight alleged the trial court erred in allowing the state to prosecute the charges under a theory of felony murder when the indictment charged premeditated murder to be absolutely contrary to established precedent. Fourth, Knight claimed the introduction of the testimony of Mr. Gill, the bank president, to the effect that Mitt Gons, the victim, had told him that he had been kidnapped and his wife was being held for $50,000 ransom, and describing what had occurred thus far. Into evidence was error, as it was not within the res geste of the crime charged. Finally, he claimed the trial court erred in denying his motion for change of venue. Having carefully evaluated all other points raised on appeal by appellant, the court found none of them meritorious as to constitute reversible error. Furthermore, the allegations of the indictment were sufficient to charge Knight with first-degree murder. On 09/30/76, the court affirmed Knight's convictions and sentence. Knight filed a petition for writ of habeas corpus to the Florida Supreme Court on 01/22/80. On 02/06/80, the court transferred the petition to the trial court and ordered that it be treated as a 3.850 motion for post-conviction relief. On 02/12/80, the trial court received and reviewed the motion. On 08/15/80, the trial court dismissed the motion, determined it was properly filed, originally as a habeas petition, and requested that it be properly filed to the Florida Supreme Court. On 10/0, Knight filed a petition for writ of habeas corpus to the Florida Supreme Court, who acknowledged the trial court was correct in determining the appeal should be processed as a habeas petition. However, the court denied the petition on 02/24/81. On 02/20/81, Knight filed a 3.850 motion to the circuit court, which was denied on 08/25/81. Knight filed a 3.850 appeal to the Florida Supreme Court on 11/03/81. The court affirmed the trial court's denial of the 3.850 motion on 12/16/82. The rehearing was denied on 03/02/83. The mandate was issued on 04/11/83. On 02/24/81, Knight filed a petition for writ of habeas corpus to the United States District Court. Southern District. The court held the petition and granted a stay of execution on 02/26/81. The court retained jurisdiction over the petition and ordered Knight to exhaust his appeals in state court. The petition was dismissed on 06/27/86. On 06/09/80, Knight filed a petition for writ of certiorari to the United States Supreme Court, which was denied on 10/06/83. On 07/30/86, Knight filed a habeas appeal to the United States Court of Appeals, 11th Circuit. On 09/06/89, the court remanded the case to the trial court for resentencing based on a Hitchcock error, which requires the courts to consider non-statutory as well as statutory mitigating evidence proffered by a capital defendant. This decision was made prior to the Supreme Court's decision in Hitchcock and was originally made in accordance with Lockett. Knight filed a direct appeal after resentencing to the Florida Supreme Court on 04/22/96. On 11/1/12/98, the court affirmed the conviction and sentence. The rehearing was denied on 03/11/99. On 06/09/99, Knight filed a petition for writ of certiorari to the United States Supreme Court, which was denied on 11/08/99. On 11/07/00, Knight filed a 3.850 motion to the Circuit Court, which was denied on 05/15/03. On 04/08/03, Knight filed a 3.850 appeal to the Florida Supreme Court. Upon careful review of Knight's motion, the court found no error in the Circuit Court's determination that denial was appropriate on each claim made by Knight. On 11/03/05, the court affirmed the Circuit Court's denial of the 3.850 motion because Knight's claims are either procedurally barred, conclusively refuted by the record, facially or legally insufficient as alleged, or without merit as a matter of law. On 02/24/06, the rehearing was denied. The mandate was issued on 03/13/06. On 07/12/04, Knight filed a petition for writ of habeas corpus to the Florida Supreme Court. The petition was denied on 11/03/05 because Knight raised the same issues that were raised in his 3.850 appeal, which cannot be relitigated in the habeas petition. On 02/24/06, the rehearing was denied. The mandate was issued on 03/13/06. On 03/06/07, Knight filed a petition for writ of habeas corpus in the United States District Court, Southern District. This petition is currently pending. Factors contributing to the delay in the imposition of sentence. The delay in this case appears to be a result of the defendant being resentenced in his Dade County case that also had resulted in a sentence of death. There have been issues regarding the defendant's competency and mental health status. The defense contended the defendant is mentally ill, while state experts disputed that contention. In February of 1999, competency hearings for the defendant began. These reports were presented to the court in November of 1999. In December of 1999, the defendant was determined to be competent. Case information. Knight filed a direct appeal to the Florida Supreme Court on 10/01/84. Among several issues that were raised, Knight claimed the trial court failed to follow the dictates of Florida. Rule of Criminal Procedure 3.210, a rule which requires the court to appoint no more than 3 and no fewer than 2 experts to examine the defendant. Second, Knight claimed that he did not know the purpose of the competency examination and that neither his attorney nor competency examiner informed him of the reason for the interview. Third, Knight also claimed the competency report failed to include matters required by Florida Rules of Criminal Procedure 3.216E and 3.211A1. Finally, Knight claimed the trial court improperly applied 2 aggravating factors when it found that he was under a sentence of imprisonment and that he had been convicted of a violent or capital felony. On 07/17/86, the court affirmed Knight's convictions and sentence. On 10/22/80, the rehearing was denied. The mandate was issued on 11/20/86. On 01/09/87, Knight filed a petition for writ of certiorari to the United States Supreme Court, which was denied on 02/2387. On 02/2389, Knight filed a 3.0850 motion to the Circuit Court, which was denied on 08/3189. Knight filed a 3.850 appeal to the Florida Supreme Court on 11/2789. The court reversed the trial court's ruling and remanded the case back to the trial court for an evidentiary hearing regarding their ruling on a Brady violation. The evidentiary hearing on remand from the Florida Supreme Court was held on 06/12/00. The delay in proceeding with the evidentiary hearing was related to the United States Court of Appeals ordering the defendant to be resentenced in his Dade County case. Subsequent to the evidentiary hearing, the trial court on 08/21/03 ordered the defendant to be resentenced. The state appealed the trial court's decision to the Florida Supreme Court on 06/26/01. On 08/21/03, the court issued an opinion in which they reversed the trial court's order, which vacated Knight's death sentence. The opinion also denied a petition for writ of habeas corpus, which Muhammad had filed on 13/02. The mandate for the habeas was issued on 20/04. Knight filed a petition for writ of certiorari to the United States Supreme Court on 03/18/04, which was denied on 05/24/04. On 01/18/05, Knight filed a petition for writ of habeas corpus to the United States District Court, Middle District, which was denied on 03/26/08 and dismissed with prejudice. A certificate of appealability of was filed on 07/02/08 and denied on 08/20/08. Knight filed a habeas appeal in the United States Court of Appeals, 11th Circuit, on 06/16/08. The certificate of appealability was denied on 01/June. Knight filed a petition for writ of certiorari to the United States Supreme Court on 07/13/09. The petition was denied on 01/25/10. On 07/24/08, Knight filed a 3.851 motion in the Circuit Court. This motion was denied on 09/09/08. On 02/02/09, Knight filed a 3.850 appeal in the Florida Supreme Court. The disposition of the lower court was affirmed on 11/05/09. And so, after nearly 40 years of appeals delays and courtroom battles, the story of Thomas Knight Askari Abdullah Muhammad ended in silence on a gurney in Florida's death chamber. 3 people were dead, families left shattered, and justice stretched across decades. His execution was not just the end of a killer's life, but a chilling reminder that sometimes justice doesn't move swiftly. And when it finally comes, it leaves us wondering, was it truly justice, or simply too late?